It only took 36 seconds. Trump pointed, smirked, and said, "Maybe we should test his IQ." The room chuckled until the royal guard calmly reached into his folio and pulled out a sealed white envelope. What was inside? It didn't just answer the insult, it shattered it. The moment Trump read it, the smirk vanished. He went quiet, like someone seeing the truth about themselves for the very first time. But before we reveal what was in that envelope and how this confrontation unfolded, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because this isn't just about being smart, it's about knowing when to speak and when to let proof do the talking. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed 8 centuries of history, but never quite a scene like this. The grand reception hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of international diplomacy. Crystal glasses catching chandelier light, hushed conversations in a dozen languages, and the careful choreography of world leaders positioning themselves for the perfect photograph. But in one corner of this gilded theater, something different was brewing. Donald Trump stood near the towering Gothic windows, his distinctive silhouette framed against the English countryside beyond. His voice carried that familiar cadence, part showman, part businessman, as he regaled a small circle of diplomats with tales of his latest accomplishments. But his attention kept drifting to something else entirely. The Coldstream Guard standing at perfect attention near the ornate doorway. Captain Theo Marsden had been selected for this assignment, not by chance, but by design. He embodied everything the British military prized: unwavering discipline, quiet competence, and a record that spoke louder than words ever could. His scarred hands gripped his rifle with the same steady precision that had once held a radio handset while calling in artillery strikes under Taliban fire. His eyes, a startling shade of grey-blue, remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the assembled dignitaries, seeing everything while revealing nothing. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. On one side stood a man who had built an empire on the power of personality and the art of the deal. On the other, a soldier whose greatest victories had been achieved in silence, whose most important decisions had been made when failure meant death, not just for him, but for the men who trusted him to bring them home. Trump's fascination with the motionless guard wasn't entirely unusual. Many visitors to royal ceremonies found themselves mesmerized by the discipline these men displayed. But there was something different in Trump's gaze, a calculating quality, as if he was sizing up an opponent rather than admiring a tradition. He'd already made several comments about the theatrical nature of British pageantry to his aide, Stephen Miller, who nodded along with practiced enthusiasm. The setting itself seemed to amplify the tension. Windsor Castle's state apartments had hosted everyone from Napoleon III to Nelson Mandela. But rarely had the ancient halls contained such a perfect storm of American brashness meeting British reserve. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. As the formal reception wound down and smaller groups began to form, Trump found himself gravitating toward the guard's position. His entourage, a careful mixture of Secret Service agents, diplomatic staff, and hangers-on, followed at a respectful distance. They'd seen this pattern before, their boss spotting something that intrigued him, then moving in for what he invariably called a closer look. Captain Marsden was aware of the approaching delegation. Of course, his peripheral vision had tracked every movement in the room for the past 2 hours, a habit ingrained through multiple combat deployments where situational awareness meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. But his training was absolute, eyes forward, breathing steady, stance unwavering. Trump circled the guard like a predator studying prey, his movements theatrical and deliberate. He'd already consumed several glasses of wine, and while he wasn't intoxicated, the alcohol had loosened whatever diplomatic filters he might have possessed. Incredible, he murmured to no one in particular, loud enough for nearby conversations to pause. Just incredible discipline. The first test came when Trump positioned himself directly in the guard's line of sight, waving a hand slowly back and forth. Marsden's eyes didn't so much as flicker. This drew a chuckle from the American president, who seemed genuinely impressed despite himself. Amazing, it's like they're not even human. A small crowd began to gather, not intentionally, but with the magnetic pull that presidential presence always created. Junior diplomats pretended to examine nearby artwork while straining to hear every word. Security personnel shifted positions, their own training kicking in as they prepared for whatever might come next. British foreign Secretary Lord Cameron appeared at Trump's shoulder, wearing the expression of a man who'd spent his career managing delicate situations. The Queen's Guard represents 8 centuries of tradition. Mr. President, each man selected undergoes right. Trump interrupted with a dismissive wave. But what's going on upstairs? He tapped his temple with one finger. All that training, sure, but are they actually thinking, or just ... programmed? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. Around the small circle that had formed, expressions ranged from curiosity to discomfort. The British diplomats recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. Their American counterparts had seen their president in this mood before, and knew it rarely ended quietly. What happened next would be replayed in diplomatic circles for years to come. Trump, emboldened by wine and audience, stepped closer to Captain Marsden until he was well within what any reasonable person would consider personal space. The guard's discipline held, not a muscle twitched, not an eyelash fluttered. "You know what I'm thinking," Trump announced to his growing audience. "I bet these guys are smart, really smart, have to be, right? Can't just put any fool in that uniform and expect them to stand there for hours without screwing something up." The comment drew nervous laughter from some quarters and stony silence from others. Lord Cameron's aide was already reaching for his phone, no doubt preparing to send damage control messages to Downing Street. The American diplomatic staff exchanged glances that spoke volumes about similar situations they'd navigated in the past, but Trump wasn't finished. He never was when he sensed an audience warming up. "So here's what I'm wondering, and this is just curiosity. You understand? What kind of IQ are we talking about here? Because maintaining that kind of focus, that discipline, ... it takes brains, real brains." The word IQ seemed to electrify the room. Everyone present knew about Trump's obsession with intelligence testing, his frequent claims about his own mental acuity, his tendency to reduce complex human qualities to simple numbers. What they didn't know was whether he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Captain Marsden, for his part, remained motionless. But something had changed in his demeanor, a subtle shift that only the most observant would notice. His breathing had become more controlled, if such a thing were possible. His grip on his rifle had adjusted by perhaps a millimeter. To those who knew combat veterans, these were the signs of a man preparing for contact. The challenge, when it came, surprised no one and shocked everyone simultaneously. Trump turned to address the room as if he were hosting a game show rather than attending a diplomatic function. "I'll tell you what," he declared, his voice carrying that familiar mix of bravado and showmanship. "I'd love to see how one of these guards would do on an actual intelligence test. Not to embarrass anyone, you understand, just professional curiosity." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes, the moment when even the birds stop singing before disaster strikes. In that crystalline instant, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, an American president challenging a member of the Queen's Guard to prove his intelligence. The British contingent's reaction was swift and telling. Lord Cameron's face had gone through several shades of pale before settling on what could charitably be called diplomatic beige. His deputy whispered something urgent into her secure phone, while other officials huddled in heated, whispered conferences. The Americans, meanwhile, wore expressions ranging from resignation to barely concealed horror. But Trump was in full flow now, riding the wave of attention that he'd always craved. "I mean, think about it," he continued, addressing the room like a classroom. "Standing there for hours, processing everything that happens around you, staying alert for threats. That's not just discipline, that's intelligence, real intelligence." Someone in the crowd, a junior minister whose name would be forgotten, by morning made the mistake of engaging. Perhaps the president would be interested in learning about the selection process for the Guard regiments. Selection process. Trump seized on the phrase like a lifeline. Exactly. There has to be testing, right? Mental acuity, quick thinking under pressure. "I bet this soldier here," he gestured toward Marsden, "could tell us stories that would curl your hair if he were allowed to talk, of course." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a man known for his stream of consciousness speaking style. His tweets fired off at all hours, his inability to remain silent for more than a few minutes at a time. Fascinated by someone whose greatest strength lay in absolute stillness and silence. Captain Marsden continued his vigil, but those close enough could see the almost imperceptible changes in his posture. His jaw had tightened by perhaps a degree. His eyes, while still fixed forward, seemed to have gained a new intensity. Anyone who'd served in combat would recognize the signs. This was a man cycling through options, preparing for multiple contingencies, his mind working at light speed behind a mask of perfect calm. The moment of truth came when Trump, perhaps sensing that his audience was beginning to lose interest, decided to raise the stakes. "You know what would be fascinating?" he mused aloud, his tone suggesting that a brilliant idea had just occurred to him. "A little friendly competition. Nothing serious, you understand, just a quick test to see what we're working with here." The suggestion landed like a bomb in the elegant reception hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the servers, trained to be invisible, found themselves slowing their movements to catch every word. Trump, oblivious to, or perhaps energized by the tension he'd created, pressed forward. "I'm not talking about anything complicated. Simple questions, logic puzzles, the kind of thing you'd see on any standard intelligence assessment. What do you say, soldier? Think you're up for a little mental exercise?" It was then that something unprecedented happened. For the first time in the entire evening, Captain Marsden's eyes moved. Not his head that remained locked in position, but his gaze shifted almost imperceptibly to focus on a figure standing near the room's main entrance. The figure that had caught Marsden's attention was Colonel James Hartwell, the regimental commander responsible for ceremonial duties at Windsor. A veteran of 30 years' service, Hartwell had seen everything the military could throw at him: desert warfare, urban combat, diplomatic nightmares, and the occasional international incident. But never quite this. What followed was a masterclass in military communication without words. Hartwell's slight nod, barely visible to civilian eyes, conveyed volumes. "Permission granted. Engage at your discretion. Full regimental support." The message was received and understood in the space of a heartbeat. For Trump, watching this subtle exchange, the silent communication seemed to confirm everything he believed about military efficiency. "See that," he announced to his audience, pointing between the guard and his commanding officer. "That's what I'm talking about. Split-second decision-making, non-verbal communication. These guys are operating on a whole different level." What Trump didn't understand was that he'd just given Captain Marsden permission to do something no American president had ever experienced: being schooled by a member of the British military in front of an international audience. The very approval Trump was seeking had just been granted, not for the intelligence test he imagined, but for a demonstration of intelligence that would leave him speechless. Colonel Hartwell began moving through the crowd with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made a decision. His approach caught the attention of the British diplomatic staff, who recognized the signs of their military taking control of a situation that had spiraled beyond civilian management. Phones appeared in hands as secure messages flew between the Foreign Office, Downing Street, and Buckingham Palace. The American security detail, meanwhile, had begun subtly repositioning themselves. Not in response to any threat. Captain Marsden represented no physical danger, but because they recognized the signs of their principal walking into a situation that could have serious diplomatic consequences. The senior agent, a 20-year veteran named Patricia Voss, was already mentally composing the incident report she'd have to file within the hour. Captain Marsden, for his part, remained motionless as his commanding officer approached. But something had fundamentally changed. In his demeanor, where before there had been the simple discipline of a soldier on ceremonial duty, now there was the focused intensity of a professional preparing to execute a mission. The difference was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who'd served in uniform. Trump, blissfully unaware of the forces he'd set in motion, continued his monologue. "This is exactly the kind of thing people need to understand about our military partnerships," he declared, gesturing broadly. The British forces, the American forces, were all about excellence, about pushing each other to be better, about friendly competition that makes everyone stronger. The words would prove prophetic, though not in the way their speaker intended. Colonel Hartwell's arrival at the scene brought with it an authority that seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the room. His uniform bore the subtle indicators of serious military service, ribbons that spoke of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland, and places whose names never appeared in newspaper headlines. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp precision of a man who'd given orders under fire and expected them to be followed without question. "Mr. President," he said, his tone respectful but absolutely firm, "Captain Marsden would be honored to participate in your proposed demonstration of military intelligence." The word demonstration hung in the air with loaded significance. Trump, hearing only what he wanted to hear, broke into a broad grin. "Excellent. I knew these guys had the right stuff. What are we thinking? Some logic puzzles, mathematical reasoning, maybe some strategic thinking scenarios?" Colonel Huff's response was to reach into his dress uniform's inner pocket and withdraw a leather document folder bearing the official seal of the Ministry of Defense. "With your permission, sir, I believe Captain Marsden's service record might provide the most accurate assessment of his intellectual capabilities." The folder's appearance sent a ripple of recognition through the British contingent. Several senior officials began edging closer, understanding that they were about to witness something significant. The Americans, meanwhile, showed the wariness of people who'd learned to be suspicious of any document that appeared unexpectedly during their president's impromptu challenges. Trump, however, was delighted. His service record, even better. "Let's see what we're working with here. I bet this soldier has an impressive background. The British military doesn't mess around with their standards." What he didn't realize was that he'd just requested access to information that would demonstrate exactly how little he understood about the man he'd challenged. Captain Marsden's file contained not just the routine details of military service, but a catalogue of achievements that would humble most civilians and impress even hardened military professionals. Colonel Hartwell opened the folder with ceremonial precision, revealing documents that bore the highest levels of military classification stamps, many of them recently declassified for reasons that would become clear. The first page alone contained enough commendations to fill most soldiers' entire careers. "Captain Theodore Marsden," Hartwell began, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent reception hall. "Commissioned into the Coldstream Guards. Following graduation from the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, where he finished second in his class of 247 cadets." Trump nodded approvingly. "Second in his class. Very impressive. What was his specialty?" "Military intelligence and strategic communications," Hartwell replied. He subsequently earned advanced degrees in international relations from Cambridge and strategic studies from the Defense College. His dissertation on asymmetric warfare in urban environments has been classified as essential reading for NATO Special Operations units. The information was having its intended effect. Trump's expression had shifted from casual interest to genuine attention. Around the room, diplomats and officials were beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just the reading of a service record, but a carefully orchestrated demonstration of exactly what kind of man had been standing silently in their midst. But Colonel Hartwell was just getting started. He turned to the second page of the file, and his voice took on the reverential tone reserved for recounting genuine heroism. "Captain Marsden's operational record includes 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq, and classified operations in 17 additional countries." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the background noise of the reception had faded as servers stopped their movements and security personnel found excuses to drift closer. This wasn't just a personnel file being read aloud, it was the unveiling of a modern warrior's legend. During Operation Herrick 15 in Helmand Province, Hartwell continued, Captain Marsden served as communications officer for a forward operating base that came under sustained Taliban attack for 72 hours. When the primary radio systems were destroyed by mortar fire, he maintained communications with higher command, using equipment he improvised from destroyed vehicles and salvaged electronics. Trump's expression had begun to change. The casual confidence that had marked his earlier comments was giving way to something approaching respect, though he clearly didn't yet understand the full implications of what he was hearing. The improvised communications system he constructed during that engagement, Hartwell went on, has since been adopted as standard procedure for emergency field communications across multiple NATO armies. His technical innovation under extreme combat stress saved not only his unit, but provided tactical intelligence that led to the successful completion of the entire operation. Around the room, military attaches from various nations were nodding, with the recognition of professionals who understood exactly what such achievements meant. Maintaining communications under fire wasn't just technical skill. It required the kind of clear thinking under pressure that separated true warriors from mere soldiers. But Hartwell wasn't finished with the technical achievements. Captain Marsden, subsequently designed and implemented new protocols for multilingual tactical communication in joint operations. His system has been credited with preventing 14 documented cases of friendly fire incidents and has been adopted by special operations units from 7 allied nations. The mathematical precision of these achievements wasn't lost on anyone present. These weren't vague commendations or routine decorations. They were specific, measurable contributions to military effectiveness that had saved lives and improved operational outcomes. The kind of innovation that emerged not from academic study, but from brilliant minds operating under lethal pressure. Trump, perhaps beginning to sense that his casual challenge had opened a door he wasn't prepared to walk through, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Impressive technical work," he said, his tone suggesting he was trying to categorize these achievements as something less than what they were. "Good problem-solving under pressure. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in our military partnerships." Colonel Hartwell's response was to turn to the next page of Captain Marsden's file. And there, the true measure of the man became clear. Operation Panther's Claw, July 2009. Colonel Hartwell announced, his voice dropping to the reverent tone reserved for the most serious military citations. Captain Marsden was serving as intelligence liaison with the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, when their forward position was overrun by Taliban forces during a coordinated night assault. The room had achieved a level of silence that bordered on the supernatural. Even Trump had stopped fidgeting, his attention completely captured by the unfolding narrative. Around them, career diplomats who'd thought they'd seen everything found themselves leaning forward to catch every word. The battalion's commanding officer and 2 company commanders were killed in the initial assault. Hartwell continued, with communications to higher command severed and surrounded by enemy forces. Captain Marsden assumed tactical command of 127 men from 4 different units: British Paras, Canadian Infantry, Afghan National Army, and American Special Forces. The implications of this were staggering. Taking command of a multinational force during combat wasn't just a matter of leadership, it required instantaneous assessment of different training standards, equipment capabilities, communication protocols, and tactical doctrines. Most officers spent years preparing for such responsibilities. Marsden had been forced to assume them in the space of minutes, under enemy fire, with lives hanging in the balance. Using only a handheld radio with limited range, Hartwell went on. Captain Marsden coordinated a tactical withdrawal while simultaneously calling in close air support, artillery strikes, and medical evacuation. He personally calculated firing solutions for indirect fire support using equipment he'd improvised from destroyed GPS units and paper maps. Trump's expression had now shifted to something approaching awe. The casual bravado that had marked his earlier comments had evaporated entirely. He was beginning to understand that the man he'd challenged to prove his intelligence had already done so under circumstances that would have broken most people. The withdrawal he coordinated took place over 18 hours of continuous combat. Hartwell continued. Captain Marsden personally carried 3 wounded men to safety, including a Canadian corporal whose injuries required constant medical attention throughout the evacuation. He maintained tactical command while serving as a medic, radio operator, and forward observer simultaneously. The mathematical precision of these achievements was overwhelming. Coordinating multiple fire support missions, while treating wounded soldiers and maintaining command communications, represented a level of mental processing that few people could sustain under ideal conditions. Doing it under enemy fire, while physically carrying wounded comrades, elevated it to the realm of the superhuman. When the unit finally reached friendly lines, Hartwell announced, his voice carrying across the silent reception hall, all 127 men under Captain Marsden's command were accounted for. All wounded personnel survived their injuries. The tactical intelligence he gathered during the withdrawal led to the successful completion of the entire operational phase. Colonel Hartwell turned to what was clearly the final page of Captain Marsden's operational record, and his voice took on the formal cadence reserved for reading official citations. For his actions during Operation Panther's Claw, Captain Theodore Marsden was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross, and commendations from the Canadian, American, and Afghan governments. The list of decorations represented recognition from 4 different nations, an almost unprecedented acknowledgement of tactical brilliance that had transcended national boundaries. Around the room, military attaches from those same nations nodded with the respect accorded to genuine heroes. The citation for his Distinguished Service Order, Hartwell continued, specifically notes that Captain Marsden's tactical innovations under extreme stress have been incorporated into advanced combat leadership training at military academies in 12 NATO countries. This was the ultimate vindication. Military academies didn't just hand out recognition, they studied and adopted techniques that had been proven effective in actual combat. Having one's tactical innovations become required study material represented the highest form of professional recognition possible in military circles. Trump, faced with this catalogue of genuine achievement, found himself in unfamiliar territory. His usual response to being upstaged was to attack or diminish, but the evidence before him was too overwhelming, too documented, too witnessed by too many credible sources. For perhaps the first time in his presidency, he was confronted with accomplishments that dwarfed anything in his own experience. The Ministry of Defense Psychological Evaluation, conducted after Operation Panther's Claw, Hartwell added, delivering what was clearly intended as the coup de grace, assessed Captain Marsden's performance under extreme stress as demonstrating cognitive abilities in the 99.7th percentile of tested military personnel. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, 99.7th percentile, in the context of military intelligence testing, which was already several standard deviations above civilian norms. This represented a level of intellectual capacity that was genuinely rare. But more than that, it represented intelligence proven under the ultimate test, life and death decisions, made under enemy fire with multiple lives hanging in the balance. Colonel Hartwell closed the file with ceremonial precision and returned it to his inner pocket. The gesture was symbolic, the demonstration was complete. Captain Marsden remained at attention throughout the entire reading, his eyes still fixed on that distant point, his discipline absolute. But something had fundamentally changed in the room's atmosphere. Trump, for the first time since the challenge had begun, appeared to be at a loss for words. The man who'd built his reputation on never backing down from a confrontation found himself facing an opponent who hadn't said a single word, yet had delivered the most comprehensive intellectual defeat of his presidency. The silence that followed Colonel Hartwell's recitation lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. In that crystalline moment, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, not just the reading of a military service record, but a masterclass in the difference between claimed intelligence and proven capability. Trump's recovery, when it came, was typical of his style, a pivot toward praise that attempted to reframe the situation as validation of his original point. Incredible, he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier bravado. Absolutely incredible. This is exactly what I was talking about, the highest caliber of military professional, the kind of intelligence and capability that makes our alliance so strong. But the damage was done. Around the room, diplomats and officials were already mentally composing the reports they'd filed within hours. Social media managers were calculating how to spin a story that would inevitably leak. Security personnel were wondering how to protect their principal from the fallout of a challenge that had backfired so spectacularly. Captain Marsden, for his part, remained motionless. His vigil continued as if nothing had happened, as if the revelation of his extraordinary record was merely routine business. This, perhaps more than anything else, demonstrated the true measure of the man that achievements which would define most people's entire identity were, to him, simply part of doing his job. The reception began to break up soon after, with various delegations finding excuses to conclude their conversations and depart. But the ripple effects were only beginning. Within hours, leaked accounts of the confrontation would appear in British tabloids. Within days, detailed analyses would emerge in military journals. Within weeks, Captain Marsden's story would become required reading in leadership courses across multiple military academies. For Trump, the incident represented something new in his political experience, a clear, documented, witnessed demonstration that his casual confidence was no match for proven competence. The man he'd challenged to demonstrate his intelligence had done so without speaking a single word, using only the record of actions taken when everything was on the line. As the crowd dispersed, and the ancient halls of Windsor Castle returned To their accustomed quiet, one figure remained at his post. Captain Theo Marsden continued his vigil, eyes forward, discipline absolute, carrying the weight of genuine achievement with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. The challenge had been issued and answered. Intelligence had been tested and proven, and in the end, the most intelligent thing anyone had done all evening was to remain silent. While their actions spoke volumes about the difference between real capability and mere performance, the lesson, for those wise enough to learn it, was simple. True intelligence doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself through what a person does when everything depends on getting it right. And by that measure, there had been only one genius in the room that evening, standing silent guard while lesser men made noise. About greatness they could never understand. In the years that followed, whenever diplomats and military officers gathered to share stories of memorable encounters, the tale of Trump's challenge to the Royal Guard would be retold with the reverence reserved for modern legends, not because of what was said, but because of what was proven without a single word being spoken in response.